Hello and welcome to the StopDevaluation podcast. I'm your host and founder of the StopDevaluation movement, Melody Hilton. The heart of this movement is to see the value in all of humanity and live courageous lifestyles of using our power for good instead of harm. We can affect change by choosing validation over judgment, and I hope you'll take your place and make a positive impact in this world. Welcome, everyone, to the StopDevaluation My Story interview with Candice Murrell. Candice, I'm so honored to have you here, and I would just love to hear your story.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share it and to connect with your listeners all over the world. It's just such an honor to be here with you today.
Well, Candice, we recognize that everyone has faced some form of devaluation, dehumanization, prejudice, racism, whatever it might be, that affects us emotionally. Have you experienced any of those things? And if so, how did that affect you?
Oh, my goodness. Yes, I absolutely have. My story actually takes place from my childhood, and I think a lot of people do. They start to feel, injustice and devaluation early on, and it sticks with us as we grow. And so, I'm a bit of an '80s baby. I grew up in the '80s, and wore funny clothing from the '80s, like saddle shoes and shoulder pads and bright colors, and all that good fun stuff. But some of the things that weren't as fun about being an '80s baby was that, my parents are actually multiracial. So my father is African American, my mother is white and Jewish. My parents met at church and had my brother and had me, but it wasn't popular back then to be an interracial couple, and more so to have multiracial children and children who came from two very different religious perspectives, right? So I grew up in the '80s during that time when it wasn't so popular, and it was a pretty difficult place to be as a child because of that. And I also grew up at the height of the crack epidemic. So, today in the United States, we have, sort of this addiction epidemic with heroin and other, modern day substances. But, back then it was more so crack and cocaine. And so those two things really impacted my childhood, being multiracial and being at the height of this crack epidemic. My parents were wonderful. They were great. Actually, specifically was a daddy's girl. I loved my dad. I went to half-day kindergarten, and I couldn't wait to come home because it was just me and my daddy. My brother was in first grade. I got to hang out with my dad while my brother was in school. My mom was at work, and he worked from home primarily during that time. So I had a chance to just connect with him and be under his wings. But my dad got kind of wrapped up in a crack addiction from that time. And so the daddy's girl that I was, it became really difficult to connect with him. And I was little, I didn't know what was happening, but as wonderful as my parents were and still are, my dad's addiction really broke me, and it broke our family. And it caused me to begin to see myself as being very different for the first time. I ended up going from an all-Black community where I was born and grew up to moving to across the way to an all-white community, still in the same city, in the city of Pittsburgh. But I ended up, moving literally across the street. There's one street that separates the Black community from the white community. And I literally moved across that street and deeper into the neighborhood. And I grew from being, kind of a standout, different type of person in an all-Black community to being the same in an all-white community, and struggling with acceptance and struggling with, having lost my dad, even though he was still around, in person, he fell under this addiction And it was so difficult to connect with him because he wasn't really in his right mind anymore. So I began to realize that I'm so different from everyone around me because of that change. And I started to see myself as not being good enough for love and not being good enough for friendships or relationships.
No.
And my self-confidence started to really decrease just because that relationship that was the foundation of my confidence, that being a daddy's girl, it was crumbling under my feet. And I didn't really know as a child how to process that.
Yeah.
So that was really where the devaluation started in my life.
Did you struggle with being multiracial to know how to, quote unquote, label yourself or define who you were?
Yes, I did. I mean, my parents, specifically my mom, they did such a great job of saying, hey, you're not black or white or Jewish or Christian. You're all of those things. You are this complete package. And you have this really unique background, and embrace it and love who you are. And so I came from a home that said, hey, love yourself. And when my parents split up because of my dad's addiction, the foundation of that support began to crumble. And so when I moved from one neighborhood to the next, it really caused me to question who I was even more. And I was around all these new children and new teachers and so forth who were getting to know me. And, a lot of times they would literally tell me, you have to choose what side you belong to. You have to choose if you're black, or choose if you're white, or choose what religious book you read, and, choose where you go to worship. And, and I never was put in a box before. And so in my mind, I was free from, labels and boxes. But in my new reality, it's like I was being forced to become something I wasn't.
Wow.
And I think what impacted that even more was, I ended up going to a not so good middle school, and the education there was really poor, and there was a lot of violence. It was the kind of the height of the gang era in the 90s at that time. And so, there was even more attempts to try to distinguish myself from the pack. There were a lot of kids who were kind of caught up in that gang lifestyle, and it was really tough for me to just kind of sit back and stay away from all of that and not be pushed into those things. And I started to realize even more that I wasn't smart enough, and I wasn't good enough, and that poor education really had an impact on me mentally too. So I went from, kind of feeling like I knew what I was doing, and I was, doing well and excelling academically and getting all A's and so forth, to really feeling so ill prepared after that middle school experience. So there were, several things that started to make me feel like, I wasn't valued. And I think what was interesting is all along the way, I started to have like health challenges too. As a child, I had undiagnosed fibromyalgia, and I was often sick, and I missed a lot of like social opportunities and time with friends because I was always sick, and no one knew why, and had all these tests, and kind of felt like a lab rat after a while. And doctors just couldn't figure out what it was until, later on in my childhood. And then as an adult, I struggled with health challenges too, with anxiety and with a botched back surgery that led to another surgery, and some challenges with, being able to have full feeling and full control of my legs. And it's just, I've had these different health challenges along the way that really made me feel so different and so disconnected as well.
It's not just culture. Sometimes it's just when life is not fair. And it's not
Yeah.
anyone's fault, but a child shouldn't have to deal with that and to suffer with pain and to try to figure out why me when other kids might be running all around and playing and you're in pain.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a really difficult time to just feel like I stood out like a sore thumb,
Aw.
just to be so different in so many ways and to feel like no one could relate because I was dealing with some things that, you know, children shouldn't have to deal with.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, it
So,
had a pretty big impact.
so were there any individuals in your life that looked at you and saw your values, saw your worth, saw your potential, and influenced you in such a way that you began to see your value?
Yeah, absolutely. I had and still have some wonderful people in my life that have really pulled the best out of me.
Mm.
And I had been thinking back to my childhood, I thought about a camp counselor of mine. I'll never forget him. He was this tall, lanky kind of guy, and his name was Howie. And there was one day when all the kids were playing, and they're playing a game of basketball, and I'm a terrible athlete. I've always been really bad at sports. And so I also wasn't feeling well that day. So I sat on the sidelines and just kind of watched everyone. And I sat by myself, didn't have any friends at camp yet. It was kind of new in that summer. And so this counselor, Howie, kind of watched me in the wings of the game from a distance. I could see him watching me. And then he started walking over and my heart started pounding, out of my chest because I thought I did something wrong. I was very conscientious
Aw.
as a child. And so I was like, what am I doing wrong? Should I not be sitting here? What am I doing? So he came over and, just said, hey, I see you sitting by yourself. Can I sit with you? And it was a simple act of
Mm-hmm.
coming over to me and asking me a question about, hey, can I connect with you for a second? Can I be with you for a second?
Mm-hmm.
Just from who was a guy who was a stranger to me. And he just sat there and, just said, hey, my name's Howie. What's your name? Let's watch this game together. And he allowed me as a very introverted, shy child to just be connected for a moment. And I'll never forget that. He didn't say much and it made me feel comfortable. It was almost like he knew that I was uncomfortable, having to have a long conversation with someone because I didn't quite feel confident in myself and I was very introverted. And so he just kind of seemed to know that about me and allowed me to take the lead in connecting with him. And it was that moment, even as a little girl, and now into my 30s, I still will never forget him and that genuine act of kindness from someone who was a stranger to me. And I was fortunate that there were other people who saw value in me too. I've been really fortunate to have great managers along the way.
Mm.
So my professional background is actually in education. So I started off my career as a teacher through a program called Teach for America that recruits recent college graduates to teach in high need school districts around the country. So I taught through Teach for America, taught fifth grade in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I worked with a number of, principals and other school leaders, mentor teachers and other colleagues and so forth. And so a lot of the great managers and great mentors that I had the opportunity to work with, they pulled out of me what I didn't know I had. I lacked
Mm.
confidence so much growing up as a child that I didn't really know what it was like to be confident and work with confidence, if that
Wow.
makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So they pulled out of me what was already in me and just was lying dormant. And they helped me understand my impact in terms of what I bring to the table professionally. And so that was kind of where I started my career, in education. And I worked in a couple other areas within the education sphere, program management, and then at a graduate school of education in New York City. then I came back home to Pittsburgh and started working in corporate America for one of the largest banks in the country. And I was working in their human resources department, specifically training some of their workers, and had a really great manager in that position as well. So I just had, opportunity to kind of learn from the best along the way, and for them to bring out the best in me.
Some of the experiences you had as a child, how did that translate as you began to see your value and worth? How you functioned with the students when you were in the educational system, or how you functioned with your coworkers in corporate America?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. For my students, I wanted to give them almost like the exact opposite of what I experienced as a child. I wanted them to feel loved and valued and appreciated, and even more so empowered to be who they are supposed to be. I didn't want them to feel like they had to fit into a little, system, or fit into, a style that wasn't their own. I wanted them to be themselves.
Yes.
And so as I was, preparing my lessons and thinking through the day and how I was going to navigate the different challenges of behavioral issues and, learning challenges and so forth, I always prepared in a place of love, not just, thinking about how do I help my students overcome, an academic barrier, but how do I do that and even more so love them in the process and appreciate them and build them up along the way.
So instead of becoming bitter, you became better. Instead of treating others like you were treated, you allowed your pain to allow you to have empathy to bring value to others.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what I realized, kind of looking back and how I grew up, was that I didn't start out, as a young child devaluing myself, right? No child comes out of the womb that way.
That's right.
And so what I realized I had done was I began to internalize the external circumstances that created that devaluation in me. And as I internalized it, my very thoughts became devaluating to me. I began to think that I'm not good enough and think that I'm not smart enough. And that internal dialogue was something I grappled with so much every day. And it tore me down emotionally and even physically. I think that's, some of the cause of why I struggled with so much illness, was because of that cycle of bad thoughts about myself and, not understanding my value and not really taking the time and care to build myself back up until I had these great, fortunate circumstances with my camp counselor, Howie, and with good managers. And now even with my husband, who's brought out so much in me, even more so than others.
So tell me how you are generating value in your world today.
Yeah, that is another really great question. So my husband and I, we are actually pastors of a relatively new church called New Culture Church in Pittsburgh. And we opened our doors just under a year ago in a neighborhood called the West End in Pittsburgh, which is a really great place, but it's often overlooked. We really felt like that's where we wanted to plant our feet. So my husband and I, as pastors of that church, we really now we help other people understand their worth and their value and really help them to grow, not just spiritually, but in other ways, economically and socially. We like to connect people to one another and really build relationships as best we can and help people know, like, hey, you're valued, you're worth something. We look forward to seeing you. We really love to build people up.
A huge part of your vision is really impacting the community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a New Culture Institute that we are working to build behind the scenes, and that's an Arts, Tech, and Leadership Institute.
Wow.
That's going to be meant to build children up in those areas and to really educate them and lead them. And then we also have New Culture Solutions, which is a faith-based think tank that's being developed as well. So we're really excited for all of those areas, and not just in the church, but building the institute and the consultancy through New Culture Solutions. So that's a lot of what we're doing. Yeah, thank you.
That is awesome in your heart to reach as many people as possible in as many spheres of influence as possible. So before we close the interview, is there anything that you desire the audience to know?
Yeah, I think, my husband and I, we just had twin girls in April. And they're beautiful. They're the light of our lives now. And just in watching them grow and develop, I realized, that it's so important to begin to value yourself and value others. Because if you don't, learn to silence evaluation, you can't fully value anyone else. And you can't fully, raise your children up to value other people. And so I think that it's, becoming a mom and watching my daughters grow and seeing how much they learn, I realize they're an extension of me. And, even though some of the things that I went through as a child and even into adulthood with some of the health challenges I've had, I realized that if I didn't learn to overcome in those areas, I would not be able to help lead my daughters. So there's I think a powerful dynamic that happens when you, as a parent, learn to overcome, and you learn to adjust the internal dialogue in your own mind, so that you can give more to other people.
That is so beautiful. And I know for a fact those two little girls are not only going to be loved, they are so radically loved now. They have just come to a mommy and a daddy who are going to fight for them, love them, value them, and just invest into them what they need to be a success. Thank you so much, Candice, for being a part of the StopDevaluation movement.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
I want to thank you for listening and encourage you to become a part of the StopDevaluation movement. Be sure to like and follow #StopDevaluation on social media, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and visit StopDevaluation.com for more information and free resources. You can help spread the movement by sharing with others, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, and most of all, by living a courageous lifestyle of using your power for good. Go out and value someone today. Your life matters, and you can make the world a better place. One word, one choice, one action of validation at a time.